So let's take a look at the numbers to see what armies in 40k seem to be struggling the most for the most people. Which are the weakest armies in Warhammer 40k? Before we dive into some numbers, I thought I'd just mention that the Auspex Tactics Black Design channel dice are back in stock again after a bit of a mad rush the first time they came out. You can find them linked down in the video description if you want some fancy channel logo dice to roll. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking army strength in Warhammer 40k, and out of any of them, which are the armies that seem to be shaking up to be a little bit weaker in the Pariah Nexus meta. For this video I thought it could be interesting to take a look at a few numbers to try and get some sort of a handle as to which armies seem to be performing the worst for most players out there. Even if, as I'll get onto, I feel like Warhammer 40k game balance isn't that bad at the moment, and a lot of the armies that have low win percentages can still be absolutely tournament topping strong in the right army list combo for a good player. In 40k there's lots of stats and numbers that you could use to assess an army's strength. I think tournament win percentage is one of the most helpful metrics. It's a nice rough and ready metric for overall army power, with the best armies tending to have high ones and the worst tending to have low ones. It absolutely does have all sorts of limitations and caveats, though I still think it's perhaps one of the best metrics for most players, given that this represents the average experience with playing the army, and we'll go through the factions in this order. To stop off along the way though, let's talk about other things that maybe show a bit of top level performance. How many actual big tournament wins they've had since the data slate came out always shows if people are finding it easy or hard to win at the top level of play. And for this one I thought it would be interesting just to throw in the amount of armies that were picked for that faction for the World Team Championships. Obviously a team's environment is very different to singles Warhammer 40k, lots of complexity going on, but I still think it's another okay metric for showing whether or not a faction's viable at top level of play, or if people don't think that the army has got a role within a team to serve. We'll also mention faction play rate at big tournaments as well. Generally stronger and more interesting armies tend to get played more, weaker armies less so, though you do have to take that in context of how many people play the army in general. Broadly at the moment I would rate game balance as really quite good right now, perhaps more so than virtually any other time in Warhammer 40k's history. If you're a somewhat good player playing with an effective army list for the faction, I'd argue that more armies in the game have a fighting chance against virtually any other than just about any other time before this, though obviously there's always room for improvement. Some armies are still weak and some factions need some internal balance help, maybe just having a few good units in their codex that carry them to victory while the rest is left by the wayside. Just to doubly underline this, most of 40k's factions are really well balanced currently. Player skill and list choice has more importance than choice of faction right now in my opinion, and that means that being in this top 10 weakest video doesn't necessarily mean that the army is super weak by any stretch, and plenty of them can compete well at a top level. It's definitely a thing in more current 40k that the average player might struggle with an army, but an expert might take that same army and be kind of unstoppable. And conversely, some armies that are above this list in win rates might struggle more on the top tables, maybe Knights and Adeptus Custodes classically being good examples of that, being a bit more of a stat check army with a lower skill ceiling. That being said though, I still think that win rate is probably the most helpful metric to go forward in terms of order for these. It more reflects the average player experience playing with an army that's at least trying to do kind of well, even if most players out there aren't realistically going to be vying for the top spots at big grand tournaments or whatever. In any case though, let's jump into it, and outside of the lower half of the meta, these are the armies that are in win percentage, kind of the mid-tier of Warhammer 40k, all on 49% wins at the moment, and here we have Imperial Knights, Adeptus Mechanicus, Tyranids, Leagues of Votann, Tau Empire and Black Templars. All solid factions and have some powerful strength and tricks in game. I'd say in terms of top levels of play, Tyranids, Tau and the Abmech here perhaps have a little bit more scope for going to the tops of tournaments. Imperial Knights, Leagues of Votann and Black Templars perhaps not being quite as easy, though they all absolutely can do so on a good day. To be honest, I think if anything it's kind of impressive that we're starting the top 10 weakest on a 48% wins. It's a pretty good indicator that faction balance is tighter than ever for the vast majority of armies. Getting into the list proper though, at least in terms of win percentage just a tiny bit lower than those above armies, we have the Astra Militarum in 10th place on this list, though realistically not exactly much weaker, and they still look like they're performing great at the top level. They've won 3 big tournaments since the Pariah Nexus update, 10 teams took them out of the 40ish at the WTC, and plenty of people are putting guard on the table right now, ranking 5th out of the 26 factions in terms of competitive play rate. They do tend to be a fairly popular army just anyway though. Overall, the latest balance changes for them did wind up helping them more than it hurt them. They did get some massive nerfs to their indirect fire, and the reinforcement stratagem is now only once per game. but it seems that the buff to born soldiers with some lethal hits for tanks and infantry, even when they're moving about, have outweighed that, maybe giving them just a little bit more of the raw strength that they needed to break through, particularly in the context of a cheaper Rogue or Dawn tank at 240 points, which is really quite a scary beast indeed. Overall, I'd say that Guard are in really quite a good place in 40k right now. Certainly not overpowered, as the win rates might suggest, able to perform at the top level, and the vast majority of their index really quite playable and strong in the right army. Things are often commanded by Lord Solar and a command squad, and the bulk of the direct damage done by Rogue or Dawns, Lehman Russes, and maybe some Hellhounds to strip some cover. You can get lots of stacking AP debuffs with things like Ursula Creed and Fields of Fire, Lehman Russ Exterminators, and those Hellhounds against the tough stuff with high saves. Kazachan Jungle Fighters and Chimeras can be nice to scrap for the midfield. Scout Sentinels are cheap, effective, and provide some good synergy. Rough Riders are a surprisingly punchy and fast-moving countercharge unit, and Borgrin are nice and tough and tanky, and what you want to have on the front line. They've got good secondary units in Gaunt's Ghosts and some Scions to score those action points, and the artillery, while it was nerfed heavily, still isn't unplayably bad. Guard can do indirect better than most factions out there, and most armies aren't really expecting to be hit by it. Overall, I'd say that the army's in a fairly good place, maybe a little bit more heavily reliant on tanks than a few players might like, and some armies can definitely give them problems, with move blocking and tagging things where possible, and giving tank commanders tricky decisions to make. Overall, I'd say they're generally in a pretty good spot though. Moving on, and just a tiny bit below the Astra Militarum on the win rates are the Death Guard at around about 47%. Again, definitely not a bad statistic at all, perhaps just a tiny bit more lower mid than a few of the other factions out there. So far they've won 2 big tournaments in Pariah Nexus, were taken by a good number of WTC teams at 9 selections. They maybe are played a little bit less than you might expect for their faction though, 18th out of 26 armies. Maybe a little lowish for them, given that they've got a good player base left over from people playing them in 8th edition. The balance changes maybe didn't change too much for them, a couple of small increases and decreases that have made a few things a little bit less auto-include, and some weaker things just a bit more viable. One of the biggest changes perhaps being to things like OC0 Nurglings not doing actions, and Plagueburst Crawlers didn't enjoy the barrage change. A lot of lists have dropped them, though some armies still look like they've been successful going heavy on them. Particularly after the changes, still pretty good overall internal faction balance. Typhus still seems to be auto-include, Death Shroud are hard to pass up at their 40 points for the damage and defense they have. Most lists tend to take at least a fair complement of damage dealer tanks and demon engines, maybe Death Guard Predators being particularly popular, though most of the rest is all quite usable too. And Plague Marines and Rhinos are still tried, tested, and much enjoyed, often jumping out with the same Biologist Putrefiers and Foul Blight spawns in support, despite the points increases. For weaknesses, they're still a bit slow and short range, and can maybe struggle to deal damage to armoured targets, unless they're able to focus a bunch of things all on one target, and hit with some fairly maximal debuffs. They're still maybe not quite as durable as some might like them to be, given their general lore and feel, but still seems that overall doing fine, even if I wouldn't rate them as one of 40k's top factions. Next up, and also on 47% wins, are the Chaos Knights. Again, pretty mid-tier and very playable, though as often tends to be the case with Knights, they haven't had quite as much top event wins. No big tournament wins in Pariah Nexus so far, though plenty of high placings. They were still taken in fairly good numbers in the WTC, with 8 teams taking them, and in terms of their tournament play rate, they were 17th out of 26, maybe a little bit lowish for them. For the balance update, a few of the big knights got points drops, and they got the super heavy walker rule to be able to stride through terrain without having to pay the command points to ghost through it. Battle line war dogs are a bit better with certain Pariah Nexus missions, though the OC0 Nurgling change has maybe switched around ally choice a little bit. Perhaps a few more Plague Bearers and Beasts of Nurgle turning up alongside the Nurgling swarms. Unfortunately, Chaos Knights still remain an army that, in competitive games, still seem to be doing very little besides spamming war dogs. It's rarely going to be a wrong choice to just absolutely max out on the Wardog Carnivores and Wardog Brigands, both in the very, very dangerous melee ones and the scary shooting ones. They move fast, have good objective control, and the sheer weight of armour can be tough to deal with. Otherwise, the Knight Lancer is one of the most played of the big knights, and now that dropped in points a little bit. A few people take other big knights, I've seen the occasional Rampager in use, and as mentioned, allied demons are still common, just handy to have some units that cost less than 140 points. Overall, their cookie cutter Wardog spam lists are still pretty fine and can be a pain to deal with. I'd say the gap has narrowed once again on the difference between the Wardogs and the big knights, particularly with that super heavy walker rule and a few of the points changes. Though still in terms of actual optimised competitive lists, the big knights aren't breaking through. Games Workshop seem to have failed to make them as good as the War Dogs for really quite a lot of updates now. As ever, knights do tend to be a bit of a stat check army with a slightly lower skill ceiling than some, and that can give them some issues at the absolute top levels of play, though it's certainly not the biggest factor in a more casual environment. In 7th place on this list we have the Aeldari, again also tied on the 47% win rates. They've won just the one big tournament of Orion Nexus so far, though at the WTC they were very overrepresented compared with most other factions. 17 teams chose to take them. I feel like perhaps they tend to shine in a team environment a bit more than some. Given their multitude of fast-moving units, it can be very hard to stop them scoring a whole bunch of points in the game, particularly against an army that doesn't have good counters to them. And maybe not the worst army to have in the roster for a bad matchup, where they can push the game to at least a close result, even if they might not win. Quite a lot of those selections were Inari as well, throwing in a whole bunch of powerful Drukhari with battle host rerolls and synergies. People still seem to be excited to put them on a table in a competitive environment. They're 10th most played out of 26, still going fairly strong there, though certainly they've fallen off quite a bit since their heyday at the start of 10th edition. The last balance change for them increased the cost of several small fast aspect units and Ivrain, and gave a few units some smallish buffs, but in general maybe not quite enough to make them break through reliably. For Aeldari, some lists do seem to get things done in really quite different ways to each other. In general, they tend to take a good number of the fast-moving aspects like Swooping Hawks, Warp Spiders, and Shadow Spectres, just tricky units to catch up, and often being able to get the jump on their targets, but more importantly just move around the board super fast and do actions and score secondaries, which a lot of armies can struggle to do reliably in Pariah Nexus with the harder ones. The Alt-Art Wayleaper is still pretty excellent as a lone operative farming command points. Farseers are nice for those Auto 6 Fates dice, which can work really well with certain high damage units or devastating wounds and things. Various anti-tank weapons are pretty effective with the battle host rerolls, and as mentioned, Inari are a particularly strong way to play Aeldari at the moment. They can dip into a whole load of Drukhari units that aren't really costed for the Aeldari synergies, getting things like battle host rerolls on Scourge squads for example, or getting Blade Storm on a bunch of Venoms with Cabalite warriors in them. For weaknesses, they don't tend to have all that much tough stuff to hold down objectives, often needing to hide on primary points or face being wiped out, and in general they won't like things that can catch up with their fragile fast movers. They won't particularly enjoy mass indirect fire, or armies that just absolutely try and rush them with a ton of speed, or teleport deployment type tricks, maybe not liking things like Necron Hypercrypt, or Blood Angels jump infantry rushing about. Just in general, with a lot of fancy movement tricks and low defense type armies, they're usually going to be a faction that does far better in the hands of someone who knows them inside out, as opposed to a newer player. Next up, and dropping a couple of percentage points to 45% wins, we have the Dark Angels. Kind of an interesting case here, where I feel like the strongest version of their list is kind of terrifying, but perhaps a more balanced army just isn't really having the success for most players. They have won just the one big event at Pariah Nexus so far. They seem to have had quite a lot of good tournament placings. Were taken by a fair few teams in the WTC, with 8 teams running them. Though if anything that's going to be kind of understated compared with the rest here, given that you're only allowed one Space Marine selection, and it means that they'd be competing against the powerhouse that is Blood Angels, so if that wasn't a factor, more people might have chosen them. Their competitive play rate is 16th out of 26, which is fairly high-ish for them. I think a few more people are interested to put them on the table after the fun buffs that they got in the balanced data slate. Talking of which, the boosts that they got were buffed Deathwing Knights and Inner Circle Companions, both of those getting massively more dangerous melee weapons, up to the point where they probably should have been when the Codex dropped, to be honest. They also got some small buffs to the Dark Angel specific detachments, though not enough to actually make them good it seems, and the Ironstorm list that they'd been running quite a lot with Azrael and Storm Ravens got hit with some pretty heavy nerfs. It now seems that by far the most common competitive way to play Dark Angels is with Gladius Task Force and go heavy on those unique melee damage dealer units. The Deathwing Knights are kind of crazily popular, lots of optimised lists running 3 sets of 5 of them, likely some Inner Circle Companions in a Land Raider or an Impulsor, Azrael in the list somewhere to generate some command points and be a force multiplier for his unit, and a fair few lists are actually taking Lionel Johnson as well, which is kind of fun. He's a big threat that can't really be ignored. Plenty of people are giving the Inner Circle Task Force a go out of the core codex, though it really doesn't look like many people are having much success with it. The movement buffs and the easy damage stratagems and the fire discipline of the Gladius just seem to add far more value, and the difference in terms of tournament performance with Gladius versus Inner Circle is enormous. Gladius Dark Angels looks like a genuine top tier army, and their stats are sort of being dragged down by people playing them in basically any other way. Overall, kind of an interesting one on the balance sort of front. Their overall win rate looks a bit underwhelming, but the story is a bit more complex than that. I feel like perhaps their biggest weaknesses are their unique options just aren't really all that solid, bar the Deathwing Knights and Inner Circle and Azrael. Most of their other cast of support characters are at least a little bit underpowered. I've seen a few people using Asmodai with Inner Circle companions though, and in particular Ravenwing doesn't seem like it's much of a presence on the table at all. The Black Knights and the Company of Hunters seemingly not having the strength to break through. Still looks like just the Dark Angels detachments in their codex in general are lagging behind the core codex Space Marine ones, which is maybe a little bit sad for them. Even if they are largely playing Gladius though, it's really quite nice to see Dark Angels actually going into battle with their unique melee options, as opposed to weird Ironstorm lists in their top level of play. Another interesting one with maybe a similar sort of story to the Dark Angels are the Chaos Space Marines. Quite a low win rate for the average player out there with 45%. But again, lots of other stats that would suggest that they do absolutely fine at top levels of tournament play. A great big 4 wins at Pariah Nexus tournaments, grand tournaments so far. And again, like Aeldari, one of the far more selective factions for the WTC armies. And lots of people are having fun putting them on the table right now. 3rd out of 26 factions in play rate. Though they do tend to be a popular faction, and I guess there's a fair bit of excitement from a fairly recent codex. The last balance update did give them more nerfs than I might have expected. Warp Talons having to destroy something to phase off the board, and also going up loads of points, and Games Workshop took a fairly heavy-handed approach to the other strong units in their roster. Lots of things 8 points increases. For strong stuff currently, by far the most played detachment is still Renegade Raiders, getting some nice advance and shoot and AP debuffs on the go, and some pretty powerful stratagems. Patchbound and Soulforged Hunting Pack being some of the other go-tos. Outside of a few very specific things, the majority of units in the Codex are pretty playable. Legionaries or Chosen tend to be jumping out of Rhinos. Vindicators, Predators and various other gun tanks do nicely enough. Cultists can sticky objectives, and Bikers can skirmish in the midfield, maybe with some Chaos Lords to provide some combat muscle. For Renegade Raiders in particular, they do like to borrow some Rubik Marines from Thousand Suns. The detachment boosts just work really nicely with those Warp Flamers, and they're a good objective skirmish unit. I'd say perhaps their biggest weakness is they're maybe not quite as much of a powerhouse type army as they used to be, at least in terms of raw numbers just to bowl over the opponent. After the points increases, they feel like they still do easily adequate enough damage with all those dark packs on the go, but often maybe don't have quite as good defense for their points cost given that it's quite high. The loss of any one unit can feel like quite a blow. In any case, a fairly interesting one in terms of strength. Most players really not managing to make them work on the tabletop as well as most factions, even if 45% wins isn't terrible, though just a few people managing to take them to next level performance at tournaments. Moving on, and in 4th place on this list are the Greenskins. They've got tournament wins of around about 44%, having fallen down a huge amount from being arguably the top faction in the game in the previous meta. Since that, despite having some pretty good numbers playing them at tournaments still, they've only managed to take down one Pariah Nexus big tournament event at time of recording, and that one was Games Workshop's Tacoma Open, which had its share of controversy with one major misplay that happened for the first 5 games of the event. It was still taken in by a good number of WTC teams, perhaps partly due to being just a popular faction in general. It looks like their play rate has fallen off a good amount since prior to Pariah Nexus, where they were the most played army in the game. They're now 9th out of 26, which is fairly lowish for Orks as it goes. The last balance change definitely hit them fairly hard, really nerfing Meganobs kind of brutally hard, and that was a big deal for Orks given how many detachments had them as a central unit, plus Green Tide getting multiple small nerfs to it in terms of points and rules changes. And between all that, it looks like most people are now playing Warhorde to try and lead the Orks to victory, maybe a few more people trying out Dread Mob, and still a few hanging on with Bully Boys. For the most part, it's still melee as the order of the day. Knobs, boys and bosses jumping out of trucks and wagons, maybe some Squighog boys as a general purpose powerhouse unit. Gasgul Thracker makes an appearance in plenty of lists, and there's a fair few people playing with some flash kits for a little bit of shooting and then melee. Can be another good squad to put out some volume fire from a transport. The majority of armies take a good number of Gretchen and Storm boys to score those actions and rustle up some command points. For their weaknesses currently, it does just seem that Orks are lacking a bit of raw strength after the Meganobs got hit that hard. It did feel to me at the time that 40 points given the 5+ feel no pain change was just a bit excessive. Maybe dropping down to something like 35 points if they're going to do that nerf might be a bit more sensible. and there's still plenty of units within the roster that just feel really quite weak and not really able to carry the army in the way that they might like to, particularly a bunch of the more DACA focused units like the war buggies and things, and plenty of the walkers still really struggle to break through even in Dread Mob, which is kind of crazy given how many buffs that detachment gives them. Overall, it does feel like they're in the place where they could use a boost, particularly to their speed freaks, to try and round out the Codex a bit more. I think there's plenty of individual datasheets that could either need rules improvements or points cost reductions though. I certainly wouldn't say that Orks are unplayably bad though. 44% wins is a little bit behind the curve, but really not a million miles away from the middle of the pack. Next up, and ranking a bit lower with a tournament win rate of around about 43%, are the Genestealer Cults. Their last major update was to give the faction their Codex. It always comes at the risk of being a bit of a mixed blessing in 10th edition, and it really doesn't look like it's gone down well in terms of the competitive scene. The Cults haven't won any big tournaments in Pariah Nexus so far. They're one of the armies that was taken by literally 0 WTC teams, so no one having any faith that they could perform well in a hyper-competitive environment there. And their play rate is 25th out of 26 factions in the game, just one faction lower. Genestealer Cults generally tend to be niche and hanging out around about that level, but at least from initial numbers it looks like they're even lower than they normally are. The Codex looking like it's driven more people away than it's brought into the faction, which is the opposite of what happens if you get an exciting book with some fun stuff in. As a result, there's really not a lot of data to analyse as to how people are running them. Looks like people have been experimenting with literally all of the detachments, maybe Host of Ascension, Xenocreed and Biosantic Brood Surge a bit more than most. With the numbers of players though, I feel like there's not really enough data to really say what's best or worst at all. The units taken can be really quite highly detachment dependent, given so many of them are really focused on certain units and keywords. The Achilles Ridge Runner is pretty much an auto-include staple with its godly AP debuffs, and generally Neophytes and Acolytes are often the damage hammers of the list, supported by the extensive cast of characters that can join them, the Primus and Neophytes still being a fairly solid staple for a lot of detachments. I feel like the main issue for the Genestealer Cults is they're just quite a lot less obvious with which way to play them compared with before. Cult Ambush as a mechanic got quite a lot weaker, less reliable for battle line, harder to get returned units back into the fight given that you can't put things straight back in reserve anymore, and it still remains swingy depending on what chooses to respawn when it dies. A lot of the detachments have interesting ways to manipulate the units, but maybe not quite as many just enormously obvious damage combos. There certainly still are a few that exist. The units in general just generally tend not to be particularly exciting for their raw damage and defense though, so do feel like they'd have to be punching up somehow with extra synergy or the Alpha Strike to really make them worth it. A bunch of units maybe feel overcosted outside of intended detachments for them as well, maybe Aberrants outside of Biosantic Brood Surge or the Atalan Jackals outside of Outlander. Again, their win rates aren't truly terrible at 43%, they absolutely can and do win plenty of games, but certainly looks like they're one of the weakest factions in 40k by the numbers so far. Next up, and suffering from their eternal balance problems that don't seem to be going away anytime soon, we have the more standard Codex Space Marines, around about 41% wins for the base Codex, just the one big event win at Pariah Nexus so far with an Ultramarines Gladius. Only 2 selections at the WTC, though as mentioned they'd be competing with things like Dark Angels and Blood Angels, and a competitive play rate of around about 8th of the 26 armies in Warhammer 40k, and that is pretty low for standard Space Marines anyway. They generally tend to have some pretty big followings for their standard chapters that doesn't tend to waver too much whether or not the actual core codex is strong, and this really does imply that a lot of people don't have the faith that they can do very well with them competitively, at least versus other options. As usual, Space Marines are a bit of a weird one to rank on this sort of ranking, given that the numbers change quite a lot depending on whether or not you look at Space Marines as a whole, including divergent chapters, or just literally the core codex chapters. And if you include the more core Codex Space Marine detachments being run by the divergent chapters, like Dark Angels or Black Templar Gladius, or Space Wolves with Stormlance, their numbers would go up really quite a lot. For the actual core Codex choices though, it often tends to be Ultramarines, Vanguard and Gladius that tends to do the best. Firestorm's still playable, though it did take some blows in the last data slate. Ironstorm perhaps understandably dropped off a bit, given that a bunch of the tanks went up in cost, as did the Storm Raven, and the enhancements both got a bit worse. For stronger choices for the Space Marines, they do tend to be very detachment dependent, lots of stuff playable, but might not be all that standout unless it's in a detachment that really helps it. They do have some okay objective support choices, infiltrators to deny the home field objective, scouts to skirmish in the midfield, jump intercessors to bounce around doing secondaries, maybe gladiator lancers as a fairly standout damage dealer that don't need much support. I'd say the majority of things are in the usable category. There's still a fair few datasheets that are rarely played, maybe things like Reavers, Invader ATVs, and Firestrike turrets. Still quite a bit of niche stuff. Overall, they're still just suffering from the Space Marine balance issue, where there's no major reason to choose them rather than the divergent chapters that get access to far more strong options than these. You have to really want certain special characters, such as Marnius Calgar plus Uriel Ventris for the Ultramarines, or Adrax and Vulcan for the Salamanders. And that has to be enough justifying passing up things that you might have got from the more mainline unique units in the divergent chapters, unless they give the core codex just something actually properly special when they're using their own detachments rather than having them pinched. They're likely to remain eclipsed. Again, still definitely doesn't mean that they can't win games. I feel like the stats are actually a little bit skewed by that entire sub-faction sort of effect, but it would be nice to have a few more reasons to play the core codex. Finally, that just leaves us with one army, and probably to no one's surprise, it's the Deathwatch, the Xenos hunting Space Marines that look like they're shortly to be folded into Codex Agents of the Imperium. Their current win rates are at 41%, and it doesn't really look like Games Workshop's changes have moved the needle at all in terms of making their veterans a little bit cheaper, or the Watchmaster's improvement with the command point debuff things. They haven't won any big tournaments. No people chose to take them in the WTC, and they're the least played faction right now, as they have been for a very, very long time. For their stronger unique options, the standard veterans, Watchmaster, Proteus team, and maybe the triple heavy weapon Terminators are some of the more interesting ones, and their detachment definitely does have some good stuff in it. The Tome of Ectoclades can put out some pretty powerful rerolls, the Beacon Angelus can do some nice rapid ingress things, and teleporting stuff around the board is always quite good. It is perhaps a bit of a shame that so many of the detachment stratagems are locked to special issue ammunition and have to be only used on bolter units though. At this stage in the day, it doesn't really look like many people will be jumping in to try and make Deathwatch work for them, knowing that they're going to have a big reinterpretation and lose access to probably really quite a lot of units in the Agents book. So I guess we'll see whether or not Agents of the Imperium as a whole is going to occupy this space on the list afterwards, or whether Games Workshop is going to actually try and make the sort of Allied Combined book actually be a competitive army with all the rest. In any case, I think I'll leave that there for now. Let me know your thoughts as to which factions you've been managing to win with and struggling with in 40k so far. Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. In general, I feel like this has perhaps been one of the more positive, weakest armies in the game videos that I've made before. Even amongst the factions that have the lowest win rates, plenty of them are still going out and stomping tournaments, which is pretty fun. I feel like maybe Genestealer Cults and Orks could do with a little bit more raw power. Space Marines need more reasons to play the actual core codex, and Chaos Knights could use their big knights being a lot better, but overall game balance and winning with the weaker factions is easier than it's been for most of 40k's history. Look forward to hearing your thoughts on things down in the comments below though. As mentioned, if you wanted some Auspex dice with some fancy logos and things on them, there's now both the black and the white style designs available once more. There'll be links down in the video description and are available from Wargame Portal in the USA. They're made by Baron of Dice. Feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly aim to try and make a similar video talking through some of the strongest factions in the game. Hopefully we'll get round to that in the next few days or so. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all of these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, an automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.